We can't just view what's happening in Ukraine in isolation of what's happening in Western Europe. We know that Starmer, the Prime Minister of Great Britain, is in a lot of trouble. He's clinging very precariously to power right now. The population, let's face it, is practically in rebellion against a government and a state that is determined to destroy them in favor of recently arrived immigrants who, frankly, aren't British, don't want to be British, will never be British. And that's not going to work very well. The situation in France is at least as bad, in some ways worse. Both Britain and France are practically insolvent. I don't see how they're going to sustain themselves too much longer financially. And then you're bringing in people like Tusk from Poland. Tusk is a globalist, just like Macron and Starmer. And then, of course, von der Leyen is absolutely indistinguishable from Klaus Schwab or Larry Fink. These are the people that want the giant surveillance state to make sure that you and I express the right opinions. And anybody that raises objections to what any of these globalists want to do inside our countries is deemed to be an extremist. And any form of speech that deviates from their wishes is extreme speech and has to be suppressed. So let's look at the catastrophic conditions, in my judgment, that you have in Europe. Now, the people that are responsible for these catastrophic decisions or conditions and are ultimately going to be removed by them are the ones that are saying, well, we have to go forward and win the war in Ukraine, which is not just a contradiction, it's absurd. There is no chance whatsoever for this Ukrainian regime in Kyiv to field any sort of force that is capable of defeating the Russians. And the Russians have made their case. They have tried to outline their legitimate security interests, and at every turn they've been rejected. We just don't listen to them. Trump went to Alaska and apparently either didn't understand what he was being told or just decided he didn't like it. So the other thing that's happening, in addition to the slow sort of disintegration of the West European governments that I mentioned, is that the world is dividing into two hemispheres. Now, one hemisphere, which is the hemisphere you and I live in, plus Europe, seems to be determined, and I'm talking largely about North America, seems to be determined to live in isolation from the rest of the world. And the rest of the world has said, fine, we'll live in isolation from you. We'll build our own parallel institutions, our own alternative to the SWIFT system, which the Chinese have created and to all reports seems to work better than our own. And by the way, our money is going to be meaningful because it's going to be backed by gold and potentially other commodities. In the meantime, we're sitting here on a ticking time bomb, a $9 trillion bill that has to be paid off at the end of the year or we face default. This is interest on our wonderful sovereign national debt that we can't retire. So this division into two worlds is probably now unavoidable and permanent. So we're not really talking to the people on the other side. We're not talking to China. We're not talking to Beijing or Moscow. We're not talking to anybody in Tehran. We're not talking to anybody in Delhi anymore. We're talking to ourselves. And we're quite convinced that we're right, everyone else is wrong, and everyone else should do what we tell them to do. It's almost Kafkaesque.
Yeah, and definitely frustrating-ish. No question about that, because these trends you're talking about are not hard to see, at least for people willing to just look at things as they are. But there doesn't seem to be a lot of willingness at the leader level to see things as they are. And let's first of all take a look at this. This is what President Trump is reported to have said after the meeting that they just held here, according to The Hill. Says President Trump emphasized that Europe must stop purchasing Russian oil that is funding the war as Russia receives over $1 billion in fuel sales from the EU in 1 year, a White House statement said. The president also emphasized that European leaders must place economic pressure on China for funding war efforts. And Doug, I mean, I just got to say that those are both nearly impossible tasks. There's a reason why the Europeans haven't stopped buying Russian oil so far, even though all during this war. And there's especially in light of the BRICS, of the SCO meeting, and of China's big celebration in Beijing yesterday, there is zero chance that you're going to successfully pressure China into doing anything against Russia. What do you make of these kinds of statements coming out of the White House?
Well, this is unfortunately consistent, not just with President Trump and everything he's been saying and doing, but frankly, everything that his predecessor said and did. At every turn, our answer to the Russians, and whenever they expressed their views on anything, whenever they tried to explain their legitimate national security interests, whenever they talked about a new security architecture, one in which Russian security, German security, anyone's security in Europe would not be purchased at the expense of anyone else. And what did we answer? We answered with escalation. We've continued to provide the Ukrainians with the means to attack Russia on Russian soil. We have been behind or had our hands in all of the quote unquote modest, successful strategic strikes that certainly garnered a great deal of attention, but did nothing to alter the course of the war. These are the drone strikes on the Russian strategic bombers, the most recent ones against the gasification refinery plants in Russia. None of these things were crippling in a strategic sense. None of these are altering the course of events. But they seem to create the illusion in the minds of the people that launched them that there's life in this regime in Kyiv. In the meantime, as I think you pointed out some time ago, we just watched something in the neighborhood of 13,000 Ukrainian men between the ages of 18 and 25 leave the country, conveying the impression that the Ukrainian government has decided that if they don't let these people go, they too will be murdered on the battlefield, because there's no alternative to that right now. They're dealing with a military machine they cannot resist. And so perhaps it's prudent to let them leave in the hopes that at some point they can come back and repopulate Ukraine. I don't know. I'm speculating. But the whole picture is ridiculous. We continue down a path that has no chance of success, but it's doing a damn fine job of alienating the rest of the world. And that's what we saw in China over the last few days. And by the way, all that Chinese military might that was on display was not aimed at us. It was simply a clear and unambiguous signal that we cannot be bullied. You can't bully us into submission. You can't force us into any sort of arrangement that is not in our interest. And by the way, they haven't said anything or done anything to suggest that they want to harm us. We're the ones insisting that their success in any way, shape, or form is harming us. I mean, stop and consider this. We've spent what, between $8 and $14 trillion since 2001 on all of these catastrophic military strategic failures. Just stop and think about that sum. The Chinese have invested perhaps $1 trillion in building up the infrastructure for the One Belt, One Road that basically is designed to connect everyone on the Eurasian continent and Africa back to China and vice versa. In other words, a new commercial structure beyond anything that was conceived of under the Mongolian Empire in terms of commercial ties between East and West. Something beyond anything we've seen, certainly since the end of the Second World War, that promises to create enormous prosperity all over Eurasia and potentially Africa in time. And we are treating that as catastrophic. Something has to be resisted. Something has to be broken because we are not in charge of it. It's not our idea. We didn't think of it. And we utterly refuse to be part of anything that we do not dominate. That's essentially what it comes down to. So Donald Trump, for all of his rhetoric about, settling conflicts and promoting peace and prosperity, is in the same business as his predecessor, trying to cling to the impossible position of global military hegemony run from Washington.
And yeah, that's expired. The use by date has passed, and instead of recognizing that, we just keep going down a bad and fruitless path. That's also mirrored to a large extent in Europe. I'm going to get to a bit of that in a second, but let's first start with Zelensky, because he's kind of deepened and dug into his trench a little bit deeper. Here's what he had to say after talking with President Trump. This is on his X account here, if you can pop that one up there. Basically, he's kind of reiterating one of the things that he said really all throughout this war, and took the opportunity again to say, he said, first and foremost, we talked about how to push the situation towards real peace. We discussed different options. The most important is pressure, using strong measures, particularly economic ones, to force an end to the war. The key to peace is driving Russia's war machine, or depriving it of money, depriving it of resources. And then he also adds, we also spoke about the maximum protection for Ukraine's skies. Until peace comes, Ukraine must not be at the mercy of constant Russian attacks. Russian missiles and drones must not take lives. Ukraine has proposed a format for protecting our skies for the U.S. to consider. So he wants some version of a air cover from the United States, and then instead of putting pressure on anyone else, he wants pressure on Russia alone, economics, which is ironic because President Trump announced right before this that he wanted to put pressure on Europe to stop buying Russian oil, and then also on China and presumably India, since he's got sanctions on them. But Zelensky's not even on the same page as Trump, because Trump didn't say anything about pressure on Russia so far. What do you think?
I think that Zelensky's prescription is global thermonuclear war launched by the United States against Russia. It's insane. It makes no sense. And my great fear is that there are people in Washington that don't understand that that is the inevitable outcome if we don't take the off-ramp and get off of this dead-end road that we're on with Zelensky, because that's what he wants. He just doesn't want Europe to support him. He wants us to make it impossible for Russia to defeat him or anyone else. Well, that's not going to happen. We have no interest in that. And I think that President Trump foolishly listens to this man, and obviously to people around him, who tell him that we are more powerful than we are, that we are in a position to dictate terms which we're not. And this man, Zelensky, is evidence for all of that kind of thinking. So the real question at this stage is, President Trump, what are you going to do to extricate the United States from this utterly pointless and fruitless policy that you inherited from President Biden? Thus far, his answer is nothing. I'm going to keep it up. I'm going to continue to do it. And if you really want to push this to the limits, you will end up in a nuclear exchange with Russia. The Russians have been very straightforward. We understand the conditions that they've described. None of those are unacceptable, frankly, to us. We do not lose as a result of supporting neutrality for whatever remains of Ukraine. We don't lose with a government in Kyiv that is at least not hostile, if not aligned with Moscow. We lose if we are dragged into a war over a part of the world that is of no strategic importance to us against Russia. That's how we lose. And what you saw again over in China was a group of people, what is it, more than 40% of the world's population, and probably at least half of its natural resources, mineral wealth, oil, gas, you name it. We saw a demonstration that they have all gotten together and said, we would like to have peace in our time with the United States, but we will not submit to Donald Trump's bullying tactics. So he's got to make a decision. Where does he want to take us? Further and further down the road to disaster and potential war? Or does he want to get off the train, go somewhere else in a new direction?